The Johnson family was on their way to the beach, an annual trip that had become a much-needed tradition after a long year of work, school, and endless responsibilities. For Marcus, this vacation couldn't have come at a better time. He was an FBI agent, always busy, always on call, always burdened by the weight of his job. But this weekend, he was going to leave all that behind and focus on his family. Tasha, his wife, sat beside him, her hand resting on his. She was excited about the time away from their hectic lives, though she could tell Marcus was still distracted. He checked his phone every now and then, looking at the FBI team's group chat, but he'd smile at her reassuringly, trying to mask the unease he felt. Jada, their teenage daughter, was in the back seat, earphones plugged in, absorbed in her music. Tyler, their 8-year-old son, had his face pressed against the window, watching the passing scenery with wide eyes. They were heading to a small beach town several hours away, where Marcus had spent his childhood summers. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful trip, just like the old days. As they passed through small towns and rural areas, Marcus felt a slight sense of unease, just a hunch, nothing specific. He dismissed it, focusing instead on the road ahead and the sound of Tasha's voice. She talked about how much she looked forward to lounging in the sun, taking long walks, and enjoying seafood. It had been a while since they'd had time for just the two of them, and he was looking forward to it. Suddenly, Marcus' phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at it quickly, frowning. The message was from his partner at the FBI, a simple line: "Possible activity in the area. Keep your eyes open. Stay sharp." It wasn't unusual for Marcus to receive updates like this. There were always threats to monitor, always things to stay on top of. But it was a holiday weekend, and he didn't want to ruin the mood for the family. He quickly typed a reply. "Got it. I'll stay aware. No worries." He locked the phone and slid it into the console, determined to focus on the family. Minutes later, the peaceful drive took an unexpected turn. As they passed through a quiet town, the car behind them began tailgating, its headlights too close for comfort. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. The vehicle was a police car, its blue lights flashing, signaling for him to pull over. Tasha noticed it too. "What's going on? We didn't do anything wrong." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter but remained calm. "Stay calm, babe," he said, taking the exit off the main highway into a small, empty parking lot. "I'll handle this." He shifted the car into park as the police car rolled up behind them. Two officers stepped out, both with an air of authority, their posture stiff and unwelcoming. One was a younger man, probably in his late 20s, with a buzz cut and a cocky stance. The other was older, mid-40s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to size up everyone around him. Marcus stayed in the car, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his expression neutral. He didn't want to escalate anything, no matter how much he suspected they might be looking for trouble. The younger officer approached first, tapping the window. Marcus lowered it just enough for the officer to speak. "License and registration, please," the officer said, his voice harsh. Marcus handed them over without a word, trying to keep his calm. The officer looked at the paperwork before his eyes flickered up to Marcus' face, sizing him up. "You know, it's not a good idea to drive around here, especially at this time of day," the officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "This is a quiet town. We don't need outsiders causing trouble." Marcus' jaw tightened, but he remained quiet, letting the officer talk. He could feel the underlying tension building, though he couldn't understand why it was happening. This wasn't a big city. It wasn't a place known for racial tensions. But something about the way the officer was talking rubbed him the wrong way. The older officer approached, crossing his arms. "What's your hurry? You got somewhere important to be." "I'm just taking my family on vacation," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even. "We're headed to the beach." The older officer looked at Tasha and the kids through the windows, his gaze lingering a little longer on Jada. Then he returned his attention to Marcus. "Is that so? You don't look like you belong here." Marcus' instincts flared, and he could feel the familiar tension of a potentially dangerous situation, though he wasn't sure what had caused it. It wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over by law enforcement, but there was something about these officers that felt different. Something didn't sit right. "We're just passing through," Marcus said calmly, offering a small, disarming smile. "We're not looking for trouble." The younger officer snorted, and Marcus' smile faded. It was then that he realized the officer wasn't just making small talk. There was a certain edge in his voice. The way they looked at him and his family was different. They weren't treating them like any other travelers. They were treating them like suspects. "Why don't you step out of the car?" the older officer demanded suddenly, taking a step toward Marcus. Marcus hesitated. He knew he could comply or resist, but neither felt like the right choice. His training kicked in. He needed to defuse this. But the officer's tone was becoming more aggressive, more accusatory. The younger officer was already walking around to the passenger side, eyeing Tasha and the kids. "Everything okay, officer?" Tasha asked, her voice tight with tension. "You all seem out of place here," the younger officer said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Mind if we check your bags? You got anything you're hiding?" Marcus clenched his fists, fighting the urge to respond aggressively. He couldn't blow his cover, not here, not like this. He looked at the officers, trying to gauge their next move. "We're just on vacation," Marcus said, his tone measured. "No need to make this difficult." The older officer ignored him, reaching for the door handle. Marcus immediately realized things were escalating. These cops weren't just making small talk. They were targeting him and his family. "Listen," Marcus said, raising his voice just enough to get their attention. "I don't want any trouble, but this is wrong. I'm going to need you to call your supervisor." The younger officer looked back at the older officer, who gave him a quick nod. The younger man reached for his radio, muttering something under his breath about needing backup. Marcus' mind raced, considering his options. If he revealed who he was now, they might take his family's safety into their own hands, or worse. If he kept quiet, they might escalate things further. The wrong move could turn this whole situation deadly. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them treat his family like this. This section builds the conflict and sets the stage for Marcus' internal struggle, highlighting the tension between his role as an FBI agent and his desire to protect his family. The tension starts to rise with the encounter, and Marcus' calm demeanor in the face of escalating aggression provides the first hint of his hidden identity. Marcus could feel the pressure mounting. The officer's cold stares were now aimed directly at him, and the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He was no longer just a father on vacation, he was a target. A gut feeling told him that the officers weren't going to back off. He needed to do something to regain control, but the consequences of revealing too much too soon could be dangerous. The younger officer, radio still in hand, shot a quick glance at Marcus, his eyes narrowing. "You're not from around here, huh? What's your name?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His mind raced. Giving a name could lead to further questions that he wasn't ready to answer, especially considering his position. He had to think fast. His first priority was keeping his family safe. He felt Tasha's hand on his arm, and her soft voice reached him through the rising tension. "Marcus, what's going on?" she whispered. He glanced at her, trying to remain calm, his expression steady. "We'll be fine," he reassured her quietly, though doubt crept into his words. The older officer was now standing at the driver's side window, leaning in, peering into the car. "You look like a guy with a few secrets," he muttered, his tone deliberately menacing. "What's your deal? You one of those out-of-town troublemakers?" Marcus could sense the blatant hostility in the officer's words. His mind flashed to his FBI training. He was accustomed to confrontation, but this felt different. The older officer's words were laced with something personal, something beyond suspicion. The younger officer finished radioing for backup, turning to the older man with an uncertain expression. Sarge, what if?" The older officer cut him off with a sharp wave. Don't worry about it. Backup will be here soon. We'll figure out who this guy really is. Marcus' heart began to race. The officers were clearly escalating this for no reason. His instincts screamed at him to act, but the consequences of revealing his true identity in front of his family were too high. If they found out he was FBI, they might get suspicious, even more aggressive. But staying silent wasn't an option either. If things went much further, they could accuse him of resisting arrest, or worse. Listen, officer, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice even. You're clearly making a mistake here. I'm just trying to enjoy a weekend with my family. There's no reason to escalate this. The older officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Marcus for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached into his belt and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. He knew this was the moment when everything could go wrong. The thought of them arresting him, his family watching, was enough to make his blood run cold. Tasha was silent beside him, but her grip tightened on his arm. Jada was watching nervously, her face pale. Tyler, still too young to fully understand, looked confused and scared. Get out of the car, the older officer commanded, his voice low but firm. Marcus' mind raced. The older officer was preparing to arrest him without cause, and the younger officer was watching, unsure but ready to follow orders. He had to make a decision fast. He took a deep breath. It was time to end this. All right, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I'm not going to argue, but if you think you're arresting me, you're going to want to make sure you know who you're dealing with first. The older officer froze for a moment, his hand still clutching the handcuff. What's that supposed to mean? Marcus' eyes locked with the officer's, his jaw set in determination. You're about to find out. He took a deep breath and, for the first time, revealed the badge that he had kept hidden. He slowly unbuttoned his shirt and pulled the badge from his side pocket, holding it out so the officers could clearly see the FBI emblem. For a moment there was only silence. The younger officer's eyes widened in disbelief, and the older officer's expression faltered for a split second. He had underestimated Marcus, just as Marcus had feared. I'm an FBI agent, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. You're making a mistake. The older officer's gaze shifted back and forth between Marcus and the badge. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but his grip on the handcuffs remained firm. So what? You're telling me you think I'm just supposed to back off because you flash a badge? Marcus didn't flinch. I'm telling you that this is an abuse of power. You've harassed my family for no reason, and if you continue, I'll be forced to file a report. The younger officer shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Marcus and his partner. Sarge, maybe we should call this in. We don't want to. The older officer cut him off, his face red with frustration. Shut it, rookie. I've got this. Marcus knew the tension was still palpable, but the moment he revealed his badge, the power dynamic had shifted. They weren't just ordinary citizens anymore. This wasn't just some random encounter. They were now dealing with an FBI agent, and no matter how much the officers wanted to press forward, they were in a difficult spot. What are you gonna do, arrest me now? Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. You've already detained me without cause, and you're trying to escalate this because of what? My skin color? My family? The older officer opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He had no good response. He realized too late that he had made a dangerous assumption. His own prejudice had clouded his judgment. The younger officer stepped back, his eyes now wide with uncertainty. Maybe we should just let him go, Sarge. The older officer seemed to deflate, his posture slumping as the realization hit him. He wasn't going to win this fight. Not now. Not when Marcus had clearly exposed the hole in his authority. For a moment, the two officers stood in silence, neither sure what to do next. The older officer glanced at Marcus' badge once more, then back at his partner. It was clear they had no choice but to let the situation go. With a frustrated sigh, the older officer stuffed the handcuffs back into his belt. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. The battle had been won, but the victory was bitter. He glanced at Tasha, who still seemed stunned by what had just transpired. He knew the scars of this encounter would last longer than the tension of the moment. The system had failed them, but he had to make sure his family was safe. For now, that was enough. The car was eerily silent as Marcus started the engine, the rumbling of the vehicle the only sound filling the air. He could feel Tasha's gaze on him, but he didn't look at her. His mind was still racing from the encounter, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body as he focused on getting them back on the road. Jada hadn't said a word since they left the parking lot, her eyes fixed on the window, her face pale. Tyler, oblivious to the full extent of what had just happened, sat quietly in the back, his head resting against the seat as he looked up at his father. Marcus took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he drove. He could feel Tasha's hand on his arm again, her touch gentle, but firm. She didn't have to say anything. He could sense her fear, her concern. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew it had shaken him. "What the hell just happened?" she finally asked, her voice low, almost afraid to break the silence. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. Not while he still felt the weight of those moments pressing down on him. "It's just the way things are, Tasha," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "People like that, they don't see us the way they should." Tasha let out a quiet sigh, but she didn't press him further. She knew he wasn't ready to talk about it, not after what had just gone down. She could feel the tension in the air, the bitterness that had settled over their once joyful trip. "We're fine now," Marcus added, his tone more assuring, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "But it's not over. Not for us and not for them." Tasha was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting to the back seat where Jada was still staring out the window. The weight of the situation seemed to hang heavy over their daughter too. "What about Jada?" she asked softly. "What do we tell her?" Marcus swallowed hard, feeling a pang of guilt twist in his chest. "We don't need to say anything yet," he replied, though he knew the time was coming. Jada wasn't blind. She could tell something had gone wrong, and it wouldn't take long for her to connect the dots. Jada spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but sharp. "I saw how they looked at us, Dad." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "Why did they do that?" Marcus clenched his jaw, unable to meet her eyes in the rearview mirror. He wanted to protect her from the world, to shield her from the hatred and prejudice that he knew was always lurking just beneath the surface. But he knew that couldn't last forever. His daughter was growing up, and soon enough, she would see the world for what it was. He thought back to when Jada was younger, how carefree she had been, how her innocence had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world. But today had shattered that. Today had been a rude awakening. "They did it because of who we are, Jada," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the truth. "They don't see us as equal, not all the time. And sometimes, they'll treat us like we don't matter." Tasha let out a sharp breath, turning away from the window. "This is the world we live in," she said, her voice tinged with anger. "This is what we're up against." Jada didn't respond, but Marcus could see her shoulders stiffen in the rearview mirror. He could feel the heaviness in the air, the unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Tyler, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, tilted his head curiously. "Are we going to the beach now?" he asked, his innocent question breaking through the tense atmosphere like a breath of fresh air. Marcus forced a smile, doing his best to reassure his son. "Yeah, buddy. We're going to the beach. We'll get there." Tyler seemed content with that, smiling back and leaning against his sister. Jada didn't smile, but she didn't seem to want to talk anymore either. The rest of the drive was filled with a quiet, uncomfortable silence. Marcus could feel it hanging over them like a dark cloud, the weight of everything that had just happened sinking in deeper with every mile. When they finally arrived at the beach house, the last of the tension that had clung to them during the drive slowly began to fade. It was a beautiful house, one that Marcus had rented for years, a place of peace and solitude. It was the perfect place to escape, to let go of the outside world for a few days. But no matter how beautiful the house was, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over him. He parked the car and turned off the engine, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore the only sound in the air. Tasha and the kids were already unbuckling their seatbelts, but Marcus remained in the car for a moment longer, staring at the ocean in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had been gnawing at him ever since the police stopped them. What was he supposed to do? He was an FBI agent, a professional trained to handle situations like that. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the raw, unfiltered hate that had been aimed at his family. "Are you coming in?" Tasha's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "The kids are already inside." He nodded, opening the door and stepping out of the car. The cool ocean breeze hit his face, but it did little to ease the weight in his chest. As he walked toward the house, he could hear the kids laughing inside, their voices filling the air with a sense of normalcy. He watched them, and for a brief moment, he felt the stirrings of relief. Maybe it would be okay. Maybe they could still enjoy the rest of the trip, forget what had happened, and just be a family again. But he knew better than that. The reality of what had just happened would stay with them. The encounter with the officers had exposed the cracks in their world, the unspoken truths they had tried to shield themselves from. The truth that no matter how far they tried to run, no matter how much they wanted to escape, the world wouldn't let them forget. Marcus stepped inside the house and looked at his family, the faces of his wife and children. He knew it was time to have a real conversation. The kind of conversation no parent ever wants to have with their child. The world wasn't what they had hoped it would be. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And it wasn't going to change overnight. But Marcus wasn't giving up. Not for his family. Not for his kids. "Let's go to the beach," he said, his voice steady. "We're here now. We're going to make the best of it." And for the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of resolve settle in. He could protect his family, but he couldn't shield them from everything. What he could do was show them that, no matter what the world threw at them, they had each other. And that would be enough. The days that followed the encounter at the gas station were filled with an unsettling silence. Marcus couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, the memories of the officer's hostile words echoing in his mind. He thought about how they had treated his family, how they had treated him, a federal agent with years of training and experience. He thought about Jada's eyes when she asked why. How do you explain that to your own child? How do you explain something that's so deeply ingrained in the world, something that feels like it's always lurking just beneath the surface? Tasha noticed the change in him. She saw the way his shoulders had become more tense, how he withdrew into himself at night. They hadn't talked about it. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. She could tell he was carrying something heavy, but he wouldn't open up. He was trying to protect them, as he always had. But now it felt different. It felt like something inside him had been broken, a shift in his mind that he couldn't quite put into words. That morning, as the sun began to rise over the ocean, Tasha approached him. He was sitting on the back porch, looking out at the horizon, a cup of coffee in his hands, his gaze distant. "Tasha," he began, his voice rough. She could tell he was struggling with something. He wasn't the man who would let things fester for too long. He was the man who would deal with problems head-on, face them and move on. But this was different. "I can't stop thinking about it." "I know," she said, sitting beside him. "I can see it. You're not sleeping. You're not talking to anyone. You've been distant. I didn't know what else to do, Tasha. I'm a damn FBI agent. I've dealt with some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and yet," his voice faltered, the frustration clear in his tone. "I couldn't even handle that." Tasha placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. She didn't know what he had been through in his career, she only knew what she saw now. And she saw a man who was fighting battles no one could see. She also saw a man who loved his family enough to carry the weight of the world for them. "You did what you had to do," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "You kept us safe. You protected us." "I didn't protect you, Tasha. Not the way I should have." His eyes were tired, heavy with guilt. "I couldn't stop them from doing what they did." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "What happened wasn't on you. You can't change the way people treat us. You can't change the system that's been built on centuries of hatred and prejudice. But you can teach our kids differently. You can show them there's another way." Marcus' hands tightened around the cup of coffee. The steam rose in the cool morning air, but it did little to warm him. He had tried to keep his family away from the reality of the world. He had tried to shield them from the hate that was always just beneath the surface, waiting to rise. But today had shown him that it wasn't enough to shield them from the truth. They needed to understand it, to see it for what it was, no matter how painful. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now, a sense of resignation creeping into his words. "I've spent so much time trying to protect them, to protect you, from this. I didn't want them to see the ugly side of the world. But the truth is, I can't protect them forever." Tasha sighed, leaning into him. "No one can protect their kids from everything, Marcus. All we can do is teach them to stand tall in the face of it. Teach them to be better than the people who want to tear us down." His gaze moved back to the horizon, his thoughts swirling. The beach, once a place of solace, now felt like just another reminder of how fragile everything was. How quickly things could turn upside down. Later that day, Marcus sat with Jada in the living room. The sun had set, casting a soft orange glow across the room. She was still quiet, her expression thoughtful, and he could tell she was struggling to make sense of what had happened. She hadn't spoken much about it since they left the gas station. She had asked questions, but now she just seemed to be carrying it with her, like a weight she couldn't shake. "Jada," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you asked me why they treated us the way they did." Jada didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him, her eyes wide and full of questions he wasn't sure how to answer. "I've spent my whole life trying to keep this from you," he continued, his voice heavy. "Trying to shield you from the reality of this world. But the truth is, the world isn't always fair. There are people out there who will judge us by the color of our skin, who will treat us like we don't belong." Tasha walked in, standing quietly at the doorway. She listened, but didn't interrupt. This was Marcus' conversation to have with their daughter, the conversation that no parent ever wanted to have. The truth was ugly, and there were no easy answers. "I don't understand," Jada said finally, her voice small, unsure. "Why do they do that? Why do they hate us?" Marcus took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. How do you explain to your child that the world they live in is not the one they imagine? How do you tell them that sometimes people will hate them for reasons they can't control? "Jada," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "it's not about you. It's not about anything you did. It's about them and their fear. People who fear what they don't understand. People who want to make others feel small because it makes them feel big." He paused, the weight of his own words settling in. "But you don't have to live that way. You don't have to be like them. And you certainly don't have to let them define you." Jada's eyes filled with emotion, her lip trembling slightly as she nodded. She didn't know if she fully understood what her father was trying to say. She didn't know what it was like to feel that weight, to feel the sting of being looked down on just because of the way she looked. But she did know one thing. Her father, this strong, protective man who had always been her hero, had just shown her a new kind of strength. He wasn't just trying to protect her from the world. He was showing her how to face it, how to rise above it. As the night stretched on, Marcus sat quietly with his family. The anger and hurt from the earlier moments still lingered, but it wasn't as overwhelming as before. They weren't powerless in this fight, not with each other. They had each other, and that was the one thing that no one could take away from them. "Dad," Jada said softly, breaking the silence, "I'm not afraid of them. I'm not afraid of what they think." Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in days. "That's my girl." The days after the conversation with Jada were difficult. Marcus could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The anger, the shame, the confusion, it was all there, swirling around, threatening to take control. He wasn't just struggling with the aftermath of the incident with the cop. He was struggling with something deeper, something he had never really allowed himself to confront. The reality of what it meant to raise his children in a world that wasn't fair. A world that wasn't kind to people like them. But there was no escaping that reality anymore. Not after what had happened at the gas station. Not after seeing the look in his daughter's eyes. He couldn't pretend anymore. He had to be honest. Not just with her, but with himself. Marcus knew that, as a father, he had a responsibility to protect his family. But he had also come to realize that protecting them didn't mean shielding them from the world. It meant teaching them how to face it. How to stand tall in the face of injustice. How to hold their heads high when the world tried to tear them down. He thought about his career, about the years he had spent in the FBI. He had seen the worst of humanity. He had witnessed corruption, violence, and brutality. He had fought against criminals who were willing to do anything for power, for wealth, for control. But even in all of that darkness, he had never felt as powerless as he did in that moment. The moment when a couple of officers decided that he wasn't enough, because of the color of his skin. It wasn't the first time he had encountered racism, but it was the first time it had happened in front of his family. That was what had hurt the most. That was what had broken him. His wife and kids had seen it firsthand. They had witnessed the way people could hate someone they had never even met, simply because of where they came from, what they looked like. And that was something Marcus couldn't change. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done, not in the short term. He couldn't erase the pain from Jada's eyes, or the fear from Tasha's voice. He couldn't change the way the world saw them. But he could change the way they saw themselves. He could teach them to stand up for what was right, to never back down, to never let anyone make them feel less than they were. But it wasn't just about his kids. It was about him, too. He had to find a way to move forward, to keep pushing through, to stay strong for his family. He couldn't afford to break down, not when they needed him the most. Not when they were already facing a world that didn't understand them, that didn't care about their struggles. Marcus spent the next few days in quiet reflection, trying to come to terms with everything. He thought about the choices he had made in his career, the risks he had taken, the sacrifices he had made. He had always prided himself on his ability to protect people, to keep them safe. But now he saw that it wasn't enough. The system wasn't built to protect people like him. And it wasn't enough for him to just do his job well. He had to do more. He had to be a part of the change that was needed, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truth. As the days passed, the family started to move forward. The conversation with Jada had opened up a space for them to talk about what had happened, to really talk about it. They didn't hide from the pain anymore. They didn't pretend that everything was okay. But they also didn't let it define them. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Marcus looked across the table at Tasha and Jada. They had all been through a lot, but there was something different now. There was a strength in their eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. They were ready to face the world, together. "I've been thinking a lot," Marcus said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "About what happened. About how we move forward." Tasha set her fork down, her eyes meeting his. "We face it head-on, Marcus. We keep pushing. We don't let them win." Jada nodded, her expression resolute. "We don't let them make us feel small." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his chest. His family was strong. stronger than he had realized. "I'm proud of you both," he said quietly. "And I'm proud of us. We've been through a lot, but we're still here. We're still standing." Tasha reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We're in this together, Marcus. We always have been. And we always will be." Jada smiled softly, the weight of the world not quite so heavy on her shoulders anymore. "We're a family. Nothing can tear us apart." And in that moment, Marcus felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a peace that erased the pain of what they had gone through. It wasn't a peace that made everything okay again. But it was a peace that told him they could handle whatever came next. They could handle the next confrontation, the next obstacle, the next fight. Because they weren't alone. They had each other. And that was more than enough. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Marcus knew that. He knew that the world was still full of people who would judge his family based on the color of their skin. He knew that there would be more battles to fight, more struggles to endure. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't broken. He was a father, a husband, an FBI agent, and most importantly, he was a man who had learned that, no matter how hard life got, he had a family that would always stand beside him. They would fight for each other. They would protect each other. And they would never back down. And that, in the end, was the greatest strength of all. The following week, life seemed to settle back into its routine, but the scars of the past still lingered. Marcus had thrown himself back into work, though he couldn't shake the image of that day, the anger on the officers' faces, the disbelief in his family's eyes. He found himself thinking about it in the quiet moments, unable to completely move past it. He knew it wasn't something that would just disappear, not with what it meant to his family, especially to Jada. He couldn't protect them from everything, but he could help them navigate it, teach them how to stand strong in the face of injustice. But in those quiet moments, he also thought about what he could do. What more he could do, beyond the job he had always known. He had spent years in law enforcement, working on cases that required precision, intelligence, and a steady hand. He had faced danger, criminals, and systems that seemed to work against him. But now, the system he had sworn to uphold was part of the problem, and it made him question everything he had worked for. It made him realize that the fight didn't just belong to people who wore badges or carried weapons. It belonged to everyone who refused to accept the world as it was. Jada had asked him the toughest question the night they talked, the question he hadn't been able to answer right away. Why do they hate us? Marcus hadn't known how to explain that to her. He had lived it, felt it firsthand, but how could he make a young girl understand something that was so ingrained in society? He knew that it wasn't about hating them. It was about fear. The kind of fear that caused people to demonize what they didn't understand, what they couldn't control. Fear that led to hatred, that led to injustice. Tasha had been quieter these last few days, but Marcus could sense that she, too, was processing it all. Her calm demeanor never wavered, but her eyes were different, too. There was a new hardness in them, a quiet understanding that her family was not immune from this world. She had always been the rock of their family, always the steady one when the world seemed to spin out of control, but now, even she had to confront the same harsh truths that Marcus had spent so long denying. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the conversation turned to the future. The world outside their home still felt dangerous, but there was something inside them now, something that told them they couldn't back down. Not anymore. "Dad," Jada said, breaking the silence. "What happens now?" Marcus looked up from his plate. He hadn't expected that question, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. He had been thinking about it for days. What comes next? He had always worked toward a goal, a mission, but now he wasn't sure what the mission was anymore. The rules had changed, and the world felt different in ways that he couldn't ignore. "What happens now?" he repeated quietly. "Well, Jada, we keep going. We keep moving forward. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. We've been given a chance to do things differently. To teach people that there's another way. Another way? She asked, raising an eyebrow. She was just starting to grasp what he meant. He could see the wheels turning in her head, the questions forming, and for the first time in days, he felt like they were on the same page. A way where we don't let this world break us, he said. A way where we fight for what's right, where we stand up for ourselves and for each other, no matter what. Tasha nodded in agreement. We can't let the world dictate who we are. Who you are. The conversation shifted from what had happened to what could be done. They weren't just talking about surviving anymore. They were talking about what it meant to live, to take control of their lives, to redefine what strength meant in a world that tried to break them. The power wasn't in running away or staying silent, it was in speaking out, standing tall, and showing up every day. In the days that followed, Marcus and Tasha began to have more conversations about the world they lived in. Not just the world as they knew it, but the world they wanted to create. They wanted a world where Jada wouldn't have to fear the police. A world where she could walk into a store, speak her mind, and be treated with respect, regardless of the color of her skin. It wasn't going to be easy. They knew that. Marcus knew that fighting for change wasn't a sprint, but a marathon, a long, difficult journey that would require everything they had. But it was a journey they had to take, not just for themselves, but for everyone who would come after them. For every child who would one day walk into the world and face the same questions, the same challenges, and the same hate. One evening, Marcus found himself sitting with Tasha in their living room, the quiet hum of the evening filling the space around them. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we're doing enough?" she asked quietly. "Are we doing enough for Jada?" Marcus looked at her for a moment, considering the weight of the question. He knew she wasn't asking about how much time they spent with Jada or how many lessons they taught her. She was asking if they were doing enough to help her navigate a world that wasn't fair. A world that would never be fair to people like her. "I think we're doing what we can," he said slowly. "But I think we can do more. We can always do more. We can teach her to be stronger, to be more than the world says she is. We can make sure she knows her worth, even when others don't see it. But we also need to be part of a bigger change. We can't just sit back and hope things get better." Tasha smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "I'm with you, Marcus. We'll do it together. All of us. We won't stop." The resolve in her voice made something inside Marcus shift. He realized that the fight didn't have to be just his fight. It was a family fight. A community fight. It was a fight for their future, for Jada's future. It was about creating a world where people were judged by their character, not their skin. It was about making sure that the next generation could live free from the fear that had hung over them for so long. In the weeks that followed, Marcus started taking action. He began speaking out more, raising his voice against the injustice he had witnessed in his career. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to use the position he had to push for change. He reached out to old colleagues in law enforcement, people he knew who were in positions of power, and started conversations about what needed to change. It wasn't enough to make a difference overnight. But it was a start. One afternoon, while Jada was reading in the living room, Marcus sat with her and asked, "What do you think about all this?" She looked up from her book, her eyes thoughtful. I think I can do something, too. I don't want people to feel the way I felt that day. I want to change things." Marcus felt a wave of pride rush over him. "You will, Jada. You will." It wasn't just a father's wishful thinking. He believed it. Jada had always been strong, and now she had the drive to match. The future wasn't certain, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting. And that was the beginning of something powerful. In the months that followed, the ripple effect of Marcus's actions began to spread. It started with small conversations, small steps, but as more people began to speak up, As more officers and public figures aligned themselves with the fight for justice, the movement began to grow. Marcus found himself at the center of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, not words, but now, those words were becoming weapons in a fight that was no longer just about him or his family. It was about the future of every black man, woman, and child who walked this earth. But the challenges, as expected, were immense. The system that Marcus had once served was far from ready to change, and he quickly learned that change was never easy. Despite the support from his colleagues and the public outcry that followed the unjust arrest of his family, he found himself at odds with the very institution he had dedicated his life to. The pressure to conform, to keep quiet, to play it safe was relentless. There were whispers in the hallways, eyes cast downward when he walked into a room. It wasn't about what he could prove to others, it was about how much he was willing to risk. Tasha could see it. The strain was starting to show. She knew the toll it was taking on him, on all of them. Marcus's resolve had never been stronger, but even he had limits, and in the quiet moments when they were alone, she could feel the weight of the decision he had made to speak out, to go against the system he had once been part of. He had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. "Marcus, are you sure about this?" Tasha asked one night, her voice soft but filled with concern. They were sitting in their living room, the warmth of the evening wrapping around them as they tried to find a moment of peace amidst the chaos. "I have to be," Marcus replied. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet frustration that he couldn't quite shake. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't go back to the way things were. I've seen too much. I've lived too much. I've watched too many people suffer. If I don't speak out now, what kind of man would I be?" Tasha nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had always admired Marcus's strength, but she knew this was different. This wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about fighting for a place in a world that didn't always welcome people like him, people like them. But she also knew that Marcus was a man of principle, a man who would never stand by and let injustice go unchallenged, no matter the cost. They had both made their peace with the fact that this wasn't going to be an easy journey. They were fighting not just for their own futures, but for the future of their children, their community, and everyone who had been silenced for far too long. The days of keeping quiet, of bending to a broken system, were over. But even with that clarity, the weight of the struggle was still heavy. As Marcus continued to use his position to speak out, he found himself increasingly alienated. Many of his colleagues began to distance themselves from him. Some silently supported him, but most remained quiet, unwilling to challenge the status quo. The resistance was everywhere, from the halls of local law enforcement to the higher echelons of power. It was a reminder of how deeply entrenched racism and corruption were in the very fabric of the system. But Marcus refused to back down. He couldn't. The press picked up on his actions. Headlines followed him everywhere, and his every move was scrutinized. He was labeled a troublemaker, a risk, but he wore those labels like a badge of honor. He wasn't going to be the cop who stayed silent while injustice prevailed. He was going to be the one who forced people to look at the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Then came the real test. A public trial, the kind that would expose everything, the officers involved in his family's arrest, the systemic issues that allowed this kind of thing to happen, and Marcus himself. He would have to face the scrutiny of the entire country, and his life would be picked apart by the media. There was no turning back now. The pressure on him was mounting, and it wasn't just the external forces he had to worry about. It was his own internal conflict. Could he truly make a difference, or was he just throwing himself into a fight he couldn't win? Jada, too, was feeling the strain. She had been in the spotlight more than ever, her face plastered across news outlets, her voice used as a symbol of hope and change. But she was just a child, and the burden she carried was enormous. At school, she was praised for her bravery, but there were whispers behind her back. She felt the weight of it, the expectation to be something more, to carry the hopes of a community that had long been oppressed. One evening, after dinner, Jada sat next to Marcus, her eyes serious as she asked, "Dad, are you scared?" Marcus was taken aback for a moment, surprised by the question. He had always tried to shield his family from the harshness of the world, but it was becoming impossible to keep them in the dark. They were living through it now. He looked at her, seeing the courage in her eyes, and realized that, despite everything, she wasn't afraid. She was strong, stronger than most adults he knew. But that didn't mean she wasn't carrying the weight of their world on her shoulders. "Yeah, baby," Marcus said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm scared. I'm scared of what this world can do to people like us. But I'm not scared of fighting. Not anymore. And I don't want you to be scared either. We have to keep going. We have to make sure our voices are heard." Jada nodded, her small hands tightening into fists as she absorbed his words. She wasn't just his daughter. She was his partner in this fight, and she would never be alone in it. Together, they were stronger. The trial was a turning point. It wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about every family who had suffered in silence, every person who had been denied justice because of the color of their skin. The courtroom was filled with tension as the testimonies were heard, but there was also a sense of empowerment in the air. For the first time, people were hearing the truth, and they couldn't ignore it. Marcus had always believed in the power of the truth, but hearing it out loud in front of a crowd of people who were finally willing to listen gave him hope. Hope that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. As the case progressed, Marcus began to see the broader impact of his actions. He wasn't just challenging the police officers involved in his family's ordeal. He was challenging a broken system that had oppressed his community for far too long. And in doing so, he was helping to give others the courage to speak out. The victory, when it came, was bittersweet. The officers involved in the arrest were held accountable, but the battle wasn't over. It was just one small victory in a war that would continue for years to come. But Marcus didn't need a perfect world. He just needed a world where people like him and his family were no longer treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of their skin. And in that moment, as he stood by his family's side, Marcus knew that they had done something that could never be undone. They had ignited a movement. And no matter how hard the fight got, no matter how much they had to sacrifice, they were never going to stop fighting for what was right. Because, in the end, they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the future.